March 9, 1987. Beverly Hills. The conference room at Columbia Pictures was filled with studio executives, lawyers, and agents, all waiting for Charles Bronson to sign the contract in front of him. $12 million for 3 films. It was the biggest offer of his career, more money than he would made in his previous 10 films combined. Charles picked up the pen. Everyone in the room leaned forward, ready to witness the signature. Then Charles set the pen down, stood up, and said 5 words that stunned everyone. "I am not signing this deal." What happened in the next 30 minutes became legendary in Hollywood. Charles Bronson, at the peak of his earning power, walked away from a fortune because the studio wanted to control his artistic choices. And his refusal to compromise did not just shock the executives in that room, it changed how major stars negotiated with studios for decades to come. This is the untold story of the day Charles Bronson chose artistic freedom over wealth, and why that decision made him more of a hero to his peers than any action film ever could. By 1987, Charles Bronson was in a unique position in Hollywood. He was 65 years old, an age when most action stars had long since retired or been relegated to supporting roles. But Charles was still a massive draw, particularly in international markets. His Death Wish films were box office gold. His name above the title guaranteed profit. Columbia Pictures had been courting him for months with an unprecedented offer, a 3-picture deal worth $12 million, plus significant back-end participation. In $1,987, this was astronomical. Adjusted for inflation, it would be worth over $30 million today. The studio's pitch was simple. They would give Charles complete control over which projects he chose from their slate. They would surround him with top-tier directors and co-stars. They would give him final cut approval on the action sequences. Everything would be first class. There was just one catch. Buried in the contract, on page 47 of 53 pages of legal language, was a clause that gave the studio final creative approval over all major story decisions. In practical terms, this meant that while Charles could choose his projects, the studio could rewrite scripts, change endings, add or remove characters, and reshape the film however they wanted, while without Charles's consent. Most actors would not have noticed this clause. Their lawyers and agents would have glossed over it or assured them it was standard language that would never actually be invoked. But Charles Bronson was not most actors. He would grown up poor, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, working in coal mines at 15. He would learned the hard way that when rich people put something in writing, they meant to use it. He would learned that standard language was often where you got screwed. And he would learn that if you did not stand up for yourself, nobody else would. So when his lawyer went through the contract with him, the night before the signing meeting, Charles stopped him at page 47. "What does this clause mean? Final creative approval." His lawyer, a veteran Hollywood attorney named Martin Baum, hesitated. "It is fairly standard, Charles. It just means that in extreme circumstances, if there is a dispute about the direction of the film, the studio has final say." "What kind of circumstances?" "Well, if you wanted to take the story in a direction they felt was uncommercial, or if there were budget concerns, or so they can change anything they want." "In theory, yes. But Charles, this is a formality. Studios include this language in every contract, but they rarely invoke it. You would have to really go off the rails for them to step in." Charles looked at the contract, then at his lawyer. "Have you ever seen a studio invoke this clause?" Martin shifted uncomfortably. "A few times, but those were situations where, yes or no, have studios used this clause to overrule actors?" "Yes." Charles closed the contract. "Then I am not signing it." Martin Baum spent the next hour trying to convince Charles to reconsider. $12 million, 3 guaranteed films, complete creative input on everything except the final say. It was the deal of a lifetime, but Charles was unmoved. If they could change anything, then I do not have creative control. I have the illusion of control, and I will not sell my name to something I cannot control. Charles, you are being unreasonable. Every major actor in Hollywood has signed contracts with this language. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Eastwood, they all accept this clause. I am not them. You are turning down $12 million over contract language. That will probably never affect you. Probably is not definitely that I have made enough money. What I have not made enough of is films I am actually proud of. The argument continued until past midnight. Finally, Martin gave up. Fine. I will call the studio in the morning and tell them you need the clause removed. But Charles, they are not going to agree to this. Nobody gets final creative control. Not even Clint Eastwood has that level of power. Then I guess I'm not signing. The next morning, Martin called Columbia Pictures and explained Charles's position. The response was exactly what he would expected. Absolute refusal. That clause is non-negotiable, the studio executive said. It is in every contract we sign. We are not removing it for anyone, including Charles Bronson. Then we have a problem, Martin said, because Charles will not sign with it included. Then maybe Charles should reconsider how much $12 million is worth. That is how everyone ended up in the conference room on March 9th. The studio executives had flown in from New York specifically for this signing. They would prepared press releases announcing the deal. They would already started development on the first film. This was supposed to be a formality, a photo opportunity, a handshake, and a signature. Charles arrived at exactly 2 p.m., wearing a simple dark suit and no tie. He looked tired. Jill's cancer treatment was ongoing, and the stress was taking its toll, but his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. The Columbia Pictures executives greeted him warmly. The president of production, a smooth-talking man named Harvey Levin, led Charles to the head of the table. Charles, we are thrilled to have you aboard. This partnership is going to redefine action cinema in the 90s. Charles sat down. The contract was placed in front of him, a massive stack of paper, professionally bound, with colored tabs marking where signatures were required. Harvey gestured to the contract. I know you have had your lawyers review everything. We are confident this is one of the most generous deals in Hollywood history. $12 million, plus back-end participation that could push your total earnings past $20 million if the films perform as we expect. Charles did not touch the contract. Did you remove the final creative approval clause? The room went quiet. Harvey's smile faltered. Charles, we discussed this with your representation. That clause is standard. Did you remove it? No, we did not remove it because it is a fundamental part of how we do business. But as I am sure Martin explained, it is merely a safeguard. We have no intention of, then I am not signing. Harvey laughed, though it sounded forced. Charles, surely you are not serious. We are talking about $12 million for 3 films. Films you get to choose. Films where you have input on every major decision. Input is not control. Another executive, a woman named Patricia Chen, who was head of business affairs, spoke up. Miss Bronson, perhaps we're not explaining this correctly. The clause you're concerned about is truly formality. In my 15 years at this studio, I can count on one hand the number of times we have invoked final creative approval. And those were extreme circumstances, films that were going wildly over budget or taking creative directions that would have killed them commercially. Charles looked at her. How many fingers are you holding up? She blinked, confused. Excuse me, You said you can count on one hand the times you have invoked this clause. So you have invoked it. How many times? Patricia hesitated. 3 times. What happened in those 3 times? Well, in one case, the director wanted an ending that tested disastrously with audiences, so you changed the ending. Yes, but against the director's wishes. Mr. Bronson, we had research showing that the original ending would have resulted in a box office disaster, but it was the ending the director wanted, the ending he would envisioned for his film, and you overruled him. We saved the film from financial failure. Charles leaned back in his chair. Or you took away his artistic vision and replaced it with something safe, something commercial, something that would not offend anybody or take any risks. Harvey tried to regain control of the conversation. Charles, I understand you are a man of principle. We respect that. It is one of the reasons we want to work with you. But you have to understand the studio's position. We are investing tens of millions of dollars in these films. We need some assurance that the final product would be commercially viable. You have that assurance. You have my name. You have my track record. My films make money. Always have. But creative control is the only thing that matters, Charles interrupted. I have made over 50 films. Some of them were good. Most of them were forgettable. You know what the difference was. The good ones were the ones where I had control over my character and my performance. The bad ones were the ones where studios interfered, where executives who would never been on a film set in their lives told me how to act, or what my character should say or do. He stood up. I am 65 years old. I do not have many films left in me. Maybe 5 more, maybe 10 if I am lucky. And I will be damned if I spend those last films making studio-approved, focus-grouped, committee-designed garbage that nobody remembers 5 years after release. Harvey stood as well. Charles, please, let us not make any rash decisions. Sit down. Let us talk this through. There is nothing to talk through. Either you remove that clause or I walk. We cannot remove the clause. It is company policy. Then we are done here. Charles started toward the door. His agent, who had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, jumped up. Charles, wait. Let us take a break. Let us reconvene in an hour after everyone's had time to think. I do not need an hour. My position will not change. Patricia spoke up again. Bronson, what if we added language that limits when the clause can be invoked? What if we specify that it only applies in cases of extreme budget overruns or content that would result in an NC-17 rating? Charles stopped at the door. For a moment, the executives thought they would found a compromise. But then, Charles shook his head. The problem is not the specifics of when you can invoke the clause. The problem is that the clause exists at all. You want me to trust that you will not abuse your power. But I have been in this business long enough to know that power always gets abused eventually. Harvey was getting frustrated now. Charles, you are being unreasonable. No actor gets final creative control. Not one. Do you understand what you are asking for? You are asking us to give you more power than we give our own directors. I am asking you to respect my artistic integrity. We respect your integrity. That is why we are offering you $12 million. Money and respect are not the same thing. The room fell silent. The executives looked at each other, unsure how to proceed. This negotiation had gone completely off the rails. They would expected some back and forth, maybe a request for more money or better perks. But this was unprecedented. Harvey made one final attempt. Charles, if you walk away from this deal, you are walking away from the biggest payday of your career. You are walking away from 3 guaranteed starring roles with major studio backing. You are 65 years old. How many more opportunities like this do you think you are going to get? Charles looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I grew up in a coal mine in Pennsylvania. My father died when I was 10, and I had to go work underground to help feed my family. I worked in the dark, breathing coal dust, knowing that Ray Day could be the day the mine collapsed and killed me. I did that for years. Years of my life spent in literal darkness, breaking my back for pennies." He paused. "I did not claw my way out of that mine. I did not survive World War II. I did not spend decades building a career just to let some executives in suits tell me how to do my job. I would rather go back to the mines and compromise who I am for money." With that, Charles Bronson walked out of the conference room, leaving $12 million on the table. The aftermath was immediate and intense. The Hollywood trades reported the collapsed deal within hours. Bronson walks away from massive Columbia deal over creative control, the headlines read. The industry reaction was mixed. Some executives called Charles difficult, unreasonable, impossible to work with. "He is an actor, not a director," one anonymous studio head told Variety. "Actors do not get final creative control. That is not how this business works." But among actors, the response was very different. Within days, Charles received calls from Clint Eastwood, Robert Redford, Paul Newman, major stars who congratulated him for taking a stand. "What you did took guts," Eastwood told him during a phone call. "Studios have been pushing actors around for decades, hiding behind standard language at company policy. Somebody needed to push back." Stallone sent a handwritten note. "You are my hero, Charlie, not because of Death Wish or The Magnificent Seven, but because of what you did in that conference room. You showed them that we are not puppets." The most significant response came from the Screen Actors Guild. Charles's stance on creative control became a talking point in ongoing negotiations over standard contracts. While actors did not win final creative control, that remained too big a concession for studios to make. They did win stronger protections for their creative input and clearer limitations on when studios could overrule actor objections. As for Charles, he did not work for another year. Studios that had been courting him backed away, afraid he would be difficult, but he did not care. He spent that year with Jill, supporting her through her cancer treatment, spending time with their children, living quietly. In 1988, he finally signed a deal with Canon Films for significantly less money, $3 million for 2 films. But the contract gave him approval over directors, scripts, and final cut of action sequences. Not complete control, but real, meaningful input. "I would rather make $3 million doing something I believe in than $12 million making garbage," he told a reporter who asked about the Columbia deal. "Money's useful, but it cannot buy back your self-respect once you have sold it." The films he made with Canon were not masterpieces. Kinjalite, Forbidden Subjects, and Messenger of Death were modestly received, earning decent, but not spectacular box office. But Charles was proud of them in ways he had not been proud of some of his bigger hits. "I had control," he said years later. "I could make choices about my character, about the story we were telling. Were the films perfect? No, but they were mine, and that matters." The Columbia executives never forgave him. Harvey Levin, in a 2005 interview long after both he and Charles had retired, was still bitter about the collapsed deal. "Bronson cost himself and us a fortune that day. We would projected those 3 films would gross over $300 million worldwide. His back end would have been enormous, and he walked away over a contract clause that will probably never would have invoked. It was ego, pure and simple. But Martin Baum, Charles's lawyer, had a different perspective. In his 2010 memoir, The Deal, he wrote about that day, "I thought Charles was crazy. I told him so repeatedly, $12 million over contract language? It seemed insane, but Charles understood something I did not. He understood that the moment you accept being controlled, you lose something essential. You lose ownership of your work, ownership of your choices, ownership of yourself. Looking back, I realized Charles was not being stubborn or difficult. He was being principled. In an industry built on compromise, where everyone sells a piece of themselves for success, Charles refused. And that refusal, that willingness to walk away from everything, made him more powerful than any contract ever could. Studios learned that they could not push him around. Future negotiations with Charles went more smoothly because everyone knew he would rather walk away than accept terms he did not respect. That is not stubbornness. That is integrity. Charles made a few more films after the Cannon deal. His last theatrical release was The Indian Runner in 1991, where he played a supporting role. By then, Jill had passed away, and Charles had largely lost interest in acting. He retired quietly, spending his final years in Vermont and Los Angeles, avoiding the spotlight. When journalists occasionally asked about the Columbia deal, he always gave the same response: "I do not regret it, not for a second." In 1999, Film Comment magazine did a retrospective on Charles's career. As part of the article, they interviewed dozens of actors who would work with him or been influenced by him. One quote from an actor who requested anonymity summed up how many felt. Bronson walked away from $12 million to protect his artistic freedom. Do you know how rare that is? Most of us would sell our souls for a fraction of that money. We tell ourselves we will maintain our integrity, that we will never compromise our vision. But when the money's on the table, when the contract's in front of us, we sign. Charles did not. He looked at that massive payday and said no. Not because he did not need the money. His wife was fighting cancer, and those medical bills were astronomical. Not because he did not want to work. He loved making films. He said no because the terms were unacceptable, because money is not worth more than your self-respect. That makes him more of a hero than any character he played on screen. Because it is easy to be brave when you are holding a gun and the director yells, "Action." It is a lot harder to be brave in a conference room full of executives telling you you are throwing your career away. Charles Bronson died on August 30, 2003, at the age of 81. His obituaries focused on his tough guy roles, his distinctive face, his status as an action icon. Most did not mention the Columbia deal. But in Hollywood, among the agents and actors and executives who remembered, that conference room confrontation became a legend. It became the story people told when they wanted to illustrate what real power looked like. Not the power of a big contract or a successful film, but the power to walk away, the power to say no, the power to choose principle over profit. March 9, 1987. Charles Bronson walked away from $12 million. He walked away from guaranteed work. He walked away from the biggest deal of his career, and he walked away free man, not controlled by studios, not owned by contracts, not compromised by money. Just Charles Bronson, the coal miner's son, who had learned young that some things cannot be bought, sold, or negotiated away. Things like dignity, like artistic integrity, like self-respect. In a business built on compromise, Charles Bronson refused to compromise. And that refusal, that willingness to lose everything rather than lose himself, made him exactly what he would always played on screen, a hero, not the kind with guns and explosions, the real kind. The kind that stands alone, faces impossible odds, and does not back down. the kind that walks away from $12 million and never looks back.